Corpse Candle by Fuboku Kosakai.
The wind, gathering force since dusk, roared like a starving sea beast as it swept over the roof ridges of the priest's quarters and the main hall. Rain fierce enough to shatter the earth struck the doors at times like volleys of gravel. Every veranda board and every pillar seemed to sob, and the entire building swayed so violently that it seemed to be floating in midair. As often happens during storms between summer and autumn, the air indoors was stiflingly hot and humid. The oppressive heat frayed the nerves and magnified the terror of the storm. It was therefore no wonder that Hoshin, a 15-year-old novice, shrank into a corner of the room, frightened by soot falling from the ceiling.
Hoshin!
At the sound of the abbot's voice from the adjoining room, his whole body twitched. He stared ahead as though waking from a dreadful dream, and for a while he could not answer.
Hoshin!
The abbot called again, more loudly.
Yes.
I am sorry to trouble you, but will you make the usual round of the main hall and see that everything is secure?
The request made him flinch and shrink back. Ordinarily he was glad that only the two of them lived there, but on a night like this he resented it. How could he possibly go out alone in such a terrifying storm to inspect the doors?
Abbot.
He barely managed to squeeze out the word.
What is it?
Just for tonight.
Ha ha ha!
The abbot's booming laughter came from the next room.
You mean you are afraid? Very well. I shall go with you, so come along.
Hoshin entered the abbot's room as if pulled there against his will. The abbot had been reading, but somehow he had already prepared a candle in a portable holder. He lit it and led the way toward the main hall. He looked to be over 50, and the faint candlelight shining up from below made his gaunt face resemble a skull. When they entered the main hall, the flame bent and trembled, and their two shadows leaped as high as the ceiling. The air was murky and heavy, and Hoshin felt as though he had stepped into a cavern without end. He even began to fear that he would not make it back safely. At the front of the hall, a black statue of Amida Buddha as large as a man sat enthroned, rendered still more imposing by the candle the abbot held before it. The abbot chanted the Nenbutsu, an invocation to Amida Buddha, and stood for a while before the statue. The golden ritual objects each caught the wavering light in their own way: the incense burner, shallow oil lamp dishes, candlesticks, flower vases, carved golden lotus blossoms, the Sumeru altar, a low scripture table, the offertory box, and their metal fittings. They gleamed like nameless insects, and Hoshin imagined that some dreadful creature, a gigantic bat, perhaps, was hiding among them with its wings spread flat. The muscles of his thighs began to tremble of their own accord. The abbot started walking again. Even he seemed affected by the eeriness of the place, for he moved faster than before. Once he had checked all the doors, he let out what sounded like a sigh of relief, his face pale. Yet for some reason the abbot returned to the terrifying hall. He went before Amida Buddha, sat in the place used for daily devotions directly beneath the statue, set the portable candlestick beside him, and spoke.
Hoshin, let us worship.
Hoshin prostrated himself like an automaton. For a while he recited the invocation with the abbot. When at last he raised his face, the Buddha's compassionate, forbearing countenance seemed gentler than ever. Yet its sublime composure, unmoved even by the storm, drew Hoshin still deeper into a dreamlike realm of terror.
This wind is terrifying.
The abbot's words made Hoshin's heart leap.
Now then, Hoshin.
After a short silence, the abbot suddenly turned toward Hoshin and addressed him in a solemn tone.
Tonight, before Amida Buddha, I must confess a terrible sin to you. I am going to tell you of a crime more dreadful than anything in this world. Fortunately, in this storm there is no danger of anyone overhearing us. Listen very carefully.
The abbot's eyes flashed, and his voice rose.
The truth is, you may think me a monk of great virtue, but I can scarcely remain seated before Amida Buddha. I have broken my vows without shame. I am a wicked man, lower than any brute beast.
What?
The words were so unexpected that Hoshin cried out. Every muscle in his body stiffened as though he had turned to stone, and he stared so hard at the abbot's face that he might have bored a hole through it.
I am a great sinner who has killed a man. Your surprise is natural. Before you came to this temple, I had another young novice named Ryojun. I killed him.
That is a lie. It is a lie, Abbot. Please do not say anything so horrible again.
No, it is true. I would not lie before Amida Buddha. To the outside world, Ryojun died of illness. In truth, I killed him myself. There were reasons for it, grave reasons. What I must tell you is terribly shameful, but this much you must hear. I have been a monk for 40 years, and during that time I have often smelled human bodies burning. At first the odor repelled me. Yet as I grew older, I began to crave it. Eventually, if even one day passed without the smell of human fat burning, an unbearable restlessness made me want to tear at my own chest and left me unable to sit still. I knew how vile it was, but I could not help myself. Neither roasting fish nor beef could satisfy me. No other smell could match burning human flesh, with its suggestion of the lurid crimson of a spider lily. You remember the story The Blue Hood from Ugetsu Monogatari, Tales of Moonlight and Rain, which I lent you the other day. A monk fell in love with a young boy. When the boy died, the monk's grief drove him to devour every morsel of the body. He acquired a taste for human flesh and afterward went out to kill the villagers. Just like that monk, I became a demon among men. And in the end it drove me to kill Ryojun. Ryojun had been ill for some time, and I seized the opportunity. I secretly poisoned him and killed him. No one imagined that I had murdered him, so his funeral passed without the slightest suspicion. Before his body was cremated, however, I cut away every piece of his flesh. Naturally, no one ever learned of it. And what do you think I did with Ryojun's flesh? Even I had no wish to go on killing people, so I wanted to make the smell of his burning flesh last as long as possible. After much thought, an idea came to me. I would make candles from the fat. As a monk, I could burn them before the Buddha morning and evening, breathe in the smell, and arouse no one's suspicion. Made into candles, the flesh would last a long time. And so, in secret, I made them with my own hands. I melted Ryojun's fat into ordinary wax and made a large supply, exactly as I intended. Every day, sacrilegiously, I burned one of those candles during the devotions and satisfied a craving baser than any beast's. At times I even burned them for pleasure outside the hours of worship. Yet to this day I have lived without suffering any punishment from the Buddha. It is terrifying to think of it. But Hoshin, my supply was finite. Burn one candle a day, and 365 are gone in a year. As their number dwindled, I grew unbearably frustrated. For the past 2 or 3 days, I have felt a desperate, gnawing anxiety. Something had to be done. Hoshin, I was so tormented that I could hardly swallow a bite of food. The candle burning here now is the last one made from Ryojun's fat. For some time now I have been beside myself. Hoshin, I found myself wanting someone to replace Ryojun. Hoshin, I wanted to kill you. Stop! What are you doing? It is too late to run. This storm is the perfect time to kill a man. Do not cry. Cry or scream all you like, no one will hear you. You are a frog transfixed by a snake. Accept your fate bravely. Come now, give me what I crave. Become the candle that will satisfy this unnatural desire.
The abbot seized Hoshin by the arm. Terror robbed him even of the power to cry out, and he collapsed into a shapeless heap, like soft taffy. But when he realized that his life hung in the balance, he clutched at his last hope and begged.
Abbot, please have mercy on me. I do not want to die. Please, please spare my life.
He he he.
The abbot laughed like a demon. At that moment the storm shook the main hall more violently than ever.
Listen. At this point, nothing you say will make me spare you. Now prepare yourself.
As he spoke, the abbot reached to his waist and took out something that flashed.
No, abbot, for pity's sake, anything but that blade. Please spare me. I do not want to die.
The instant he heard this, the abbot slowly lowered his upraised arm.
Do you value your life so dearly?
Yes.
Hoshin pressed his palms together and implored the abbot as though in prayer.
Then I shall spare your life. In return, will you do anything I tell you?
Yes. Anything.
You are certain?
Yes.
Then will you help me kill someone?
What?
If I spare you, I must kill someone in your place. Will you help me do it?
Is something as horrible as that?
You refuse?
But.
Then would you rather let me kill you?
Please, abbot.
Well?
I will do anything.
You will help me?
Yes.
Good. Then we shall begin at once.
What?
We will kill someone now.
Where will we do it?
Here.
Whom are we going to kill?
Instead of answering, the abbot pointed with his left hand toward Amida Buddha and fixed Hoshin with a deadly look.
You mean Amida Buddha?
No. There is a thief hiding behind the statue. He slipped into this temple under cover of the storm to steal the offerings. He will take your place. Come.
The abbot rose. But before Hoshin could get to his feet, something extraordinary happened. From behind Amida Buddha, a pitch-black monster like an enormous rat sprang forth, scattering everything in its path as it fled headlong from the hall. Several seconds passed before Hoshin understood that it was a masked thief.
Abbot.
Strangely, Hoshin forgot his fear at that moment. He shouted and was about to run after the thief when the abbot gripped his arm. With a gentle expression utterly unlike the face he had worn until then, the abbot spoke.
Let him be. Let him go. But Hoshin, forgive me. Everything I told you about those candles was a story I invented on the spur of the moment. A little while ago, I glimpsed something moving behind Amida Buddha. I guessed that a thief had slipped in under cover of the storm to steal the offerings. I did not dare raise an alarm, for there was no telling what he might do. The only safe course was to frighten him away. If he were to start brandishing a sword, he might kill us both. Fortunately, he believed my story and fled. This candle is perfectly ordinary. Ryojun truly did die of illness. I was reading Ugetsu Monogatari tonight, and it gave me the idea for the story that frightened you.
With that, he held out the shining object in his right hand and continued.
The thing you call the blade is this folding fan. Fear makes one thing look like another. I am sure the thief mistook it for a blade as well.
The storm continued to rage with undiminished fury.
The Japanese Mystery Library. Classic mysteries from Japan in English. Subscribe to hear the next story.